I was supposed to be dead by now. At least, that's what my children believed when they raised their champagne glasses in my own living room, toasting to what they called my inevitable departure. I watched from the shadows of the hallway as my son Michael, 42 years old, clinked glasses with my daughter Sarah, 38, both laughing about how they would finally divide my fortune. Sarah even joked about selling the house where she took her first steps, where I nursed her through every fever, every heartbreak. Can you imagine discovering that your own flesh and blood are celebrating your anticipated death? What would you do if you overheard your children discussing your funeral arrangements while you're still breathing, still fighting, still very much alive? I remained silent in that hallway, my heart breaking with every word. But I already knew that within the next few days, my response would forever change the destiny of our family and teach them a lesson they would never forget. My name is Margaret Wellington, and I am 71 years old. For 45 years, I was a corporate attorney specializing in estate law and family trusts. I built my career helping wealthy families protect their legacies, never imagining I would need to use those same skills to protect myself from my own children. After my husband Robert passed away 5 years ago, I became the sole owner of a fortune worth $12 million, 3 properties, and a successful law firm that I had built from nothing. I had always been the strong one in the family. When Robert was diagnosed with cancer, I managed his treatment, our businesses, and kept our family together. When the children struggled financially, I was there with loans that became gifts, with advice that became solutions. I was the foundation upon which they built their comfortable lives, never asking for anything in return except their love and respect. But love and respect, I discovered that evening, have expiration dates when money is involved. The conversation I overheard wasn't their first. For months, they had been meeting at my house, ostensibly to check on Mom's health, but really to inventory my possessions and plan their inheritance. Sarah had already chosen which paintings she wanted from my collection. Michael had his eye on the lake house where we spent every summer of his childhood. They spoke about me as if I were already gone, as if my advanced age made my death not just inevitable, but convenient. "She's been getting weaker," Sarah said that night, swirling her wine in a crystal glass I had given her for her wedding. Dr. Harrison mentioned she might not have much time left. Dr. Harrison had said no such thing. My last checkup had been excellent for a woman my age, but Sarah needed me to be dying to justify what came next. Michael nodded gravely, playing his part in this macabre theater. "We should start thinking about the arrangements, the funeral, the estate division, selling some properties before the market changes. The sooner we get the legal process started, the better," Sarah added. "We don't want complications or taxes eating into what we've rightfully inherited." Rightfully inherited. Those words cut deeper than any blade could, as if my life's work, my sacrifice, my love, had been nothing more than a delayed payment they were owed. But what shocked me most wasn't their greed. I had seen enough family disputes in my legal career to know that money transforms even the most loving children into strangers. What shocked me was their complete certainty that they knew the contents of my will. They discussed my assets as if they had already read every page, already calculated every dollar. That's when I realized they hadn't just been planning my funeral. They had been planning something far more sinister. The next morning, I made a phone call that would begin the most important case of my legal career, the case of my own life and legacy. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep their betrayal went, and more importantly, how long they had been planning to cash in on my death. As I dialed my private investigator's number, I couldn't help but smile for the first time in months. They had trained under a master of legal strategy for their entire lives, but somehow they forgot the most important lesson I had taught them. Never underestimate your opponent, especially when that opponent is the woman who taught you everything you know. The game was just beginning, and they had no idea they were already losing. 3 days after the champagne toast, I discovered just how wrong I had been about my children. I thought I had witnessed the depths of their betrayal, but I was merely standing at the edge of an abyss that went much deeper than I could have imagined. My private investigator, James Crawford, had been discreet in his 30 years of experience, but even he seemed shaken when he called me that Tuesday morning. "Mrs. Wellington," he said, his voice unusually grave, "we need to meet in person. What I've found It's not something we should discuss over the phone. I met him at a small cafe downtown, far from any place my children might recognize me. James was a man who had seen the worst of human nature in his line of work, but as he slid a thick manila folder across the table, his hands were trembling slightly. "Margaret, your children haven't just been planning your funeral," he began, opening the folder to reveal photographs, bank statements, and legal documents. "They've been actively working to expedite it." The first photograph showed my son Michael leaving the office of Dr. Harrison, my longtime physician. The timestamp indicated he had been there 6 times in the past 2 months, times when I had no appointments, times when I wasn't even aware he had been there. "He's been meeting with your doctor," James explained, claiming to be concerned about your mental state. "He's been suggesting that you've been showing signs of dementia, that you've been making irrational financial decisions." My blood ran cold. In a state law, a diagnosis of mental incompetence could invalidate any changes to a will. If Dr. Harrison believed I was losing my mental faculties, any modifications I might make to my testament could be challenged successfully in court. But the photographs were just the beginning. James showed me bank statements that made my heart stop. Sarah had been accessing my financial accounts using an old power of attorney document from when Robert was sick, a document that should have been voided upon his death, but which she had somehow managed to keep active. "She's been moving money," James said, pointing to a series of transfers. "Small amounts at first, probably testing to see if you'd notice. But in the last month, she's transferred over $400,000 into accounts that she and Michael opened jointly. $400,000. Money I had earned through decades of legal work, money I had planned to leave for my grandchildren's education, money that was supposed to secure their futures, not fund my children's immediate gratification. There's more," James continued, his expression growing darker. "They've been in contact with a probate attorney named Richard Blackstone. He specializes in contesting wills and expediting estate settlements. According to my sources, they've already paid him a $50,000 retainer." I stared at the documents, feeling as though I was reading about strangers, not the children I had raised with love and sacrifice. "They're planning to contest my will before I'm even dead?" "That's the genius of their plan," James said with bitter admiration. "If they can establish that you're mentally incompetent now, they can challenge any will you currently have. But more than that, they've been working with Blackstone to ensure that when you do die, the estate settlement happens quickly, before anyone can ask too many questions about the missing money. The missing money. As if my own children had become common thieves. Except their theft was far more sophisticated and far more cruel." James pulled out another set of documents. "They've also been meeting with real estate agents about selling your properties. The lake house, the downtown condo, even this house where you've lived for 30 years. They've already gotten appraisals, already discussed listing strategies. I thought about the lake house where we had spent every summer, where I had taught them to swim, where we had barbecued on the deck while watching sunsets over the water. In their minds, it was already sold, already converted to cash in their bank accounts. But the most disturbing part," James said, lowering his voice, "is what I discovered about your medical care." He showed me a prescription record that made my stomach turn. Sarah had been picking up medications prescribed for me, medications I had never requested, medications for conditions I didn't have. Sleeping pills, anxiety medication, blood pressure pills that would be dangerous for someone with your current health profile, James explained. "She's been telling the pharmacy that you're too frail to pick them up yourself." The implications hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just stealing my money and planning my funeral. They were potentially trying to accelerate my death through a carefully orchestrated combination of wrong medications and medical neglect. "There's one more thing," James said, hesitating. "I followed Sarah yesterday. She went to a funeral home, my own daughter, at a funeral home while I was alive and healthy, planning the details of my burial as if it were a dinner party she was organizing. I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of their betrayal. This wasn't simple greed or impatience about an inheritance. This was a calculated conspiracy to steal my life, my money, and my dignity. But as the shock wore off, I felt something else rising within me, a cold, clear anger that I hadn't experienced since my courtroom days. This was the same feeling I used to get when I was about to destroy an opponent who had underestimated me. "James," I said, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions inside me. "I need you to document everything, every transaction, every meeting, every prescription, and I need you to do it in a way that would hold up in court." He nodded, understanding immediately. "You're building a case." "I'm building more than a case," I replied, closing the folder with quiet determination. "I'm building their downfall. They want to play games with my life. They're about to learn that I didn't become a successful attorney by being anyone's victim. I had spent 45 years protecting other people's families from exactly this kind of betrayal. Now it was time to protect myself, and in doing so, teach my children the most expensive lesson of their lives. The war they had started in my living room with champagne glasses was about to become a battle they could never win. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of their conspiracy, because something told me I still hadn't discovered their worst betrayal. By Friday of that same week, I had learned to see my own home as a crime scene. Every conversation with my children, every visit, every seemingly innocent phone call was now suspect. But what I discovered next made their previous betrayals look like amateur hour. I was in my study, reviewing the documents James had given me when I heard Sarah's key in the front door. She had kept her key from when she helped me after Robert's death, and I had never asked for it back. Now I understood why she had been so insistent on keeping it. "Mom?" she called out, her voice saccharine with false concern. "I brought you some groceries." I quickly hid the investigation folder and walked to the kitchen, where Sarah was unpacking bags with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. But as I watched her, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. She was wearing latex gloves. "Sweetheart, why are you wearing gloves?" I asked, keeping my voice light and curious. Sarah didn't miss a beat. "Oh, I've been having a skin reaction to some cleaning products at home. My doctor recommended I wear these until it clears up." A plausible lie, delivered with the smoothness of someone who had practiced it. But I had spent decades reading people in courtrooms, and I knew deception when I saw it. Sarah was wearing gloves because she didn't want to leave fingerprints. I watched as she methodically went through my medicine cabinet, my kitchen cabinets, my personal papers on the counter. She wasn't just delivering groceries. She was conducting a search, looking for something specific. "Mom, have you been taking your medications regularly?" she asked, holding up one of the prescription bottles James had mentioned. "I worry that you might forget sometimes." "I'm managing fine," I replied. But Sarah had already opened the bottle and was counting the pills. "These anxiety medications, Dr. Harrison prescribed, should help you sleep better," she said, shaking 2 pills into her gloved palm. "Why don't you take them now? You look tired." Dr. Harrison had never prescribed anxiety medications for me. These were the pills Sarah had been picking up fraudulently, pills that could be dangerous for someone with my medical history. She wasn't just stealing my money. She was trying to medicate me into compliance, or worse. "I'll take them later," I said, but Sarah's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. For just a moment, I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes that I had never seen before. "Mom, I really think you should take them now. You've been under so much stress since Dad died, and these will help." The pressure in her voice, the insistence, the way she was still holding those pills, everything about the moment felt wrong. This wasn't a daughter caring for her mother. This was someone executing a plan. I pretended to take the pills, palming them instead, and Sarah's relief was visible. She stayed for another hour, during which I observed her with new eyes. She photographed several documents on my desk with her phone. She opened and closed drawers as if checking their contents. She even measured the dimensions of some of my artwork, taking notes in a small notebook. After she left, I immediately called James. "I need you to analyze these pills," I said, describing what had happened. "And I need to know more about Dr. Harrison's involvement in all this." James's investigation into Dr. Harrison revealed something that shook me to my core. My trusted physician of 15 years had been accepting payments from Michael, payments disguised as consulting fees for a medical research project that didn't exist. "Your son has been paying Dr. Harrison $5,000 a month for the past 6 months, James reported. In exchange, Harrison has been documenting concerns about your mental state, creating a medical paper trail that suggests you're suffering from early-stage dementia. The medical records James obtained through his contacts painted a picture of a woman losing her grip on reality. According to Dr. Harrison's notes, I had been confused during appointments I had never attended, had asked repetitive questions about medications I had never discussed, and had shown signs of paranoia and memory loss. "This is a complete fabrication," I told James, my hands shaking with rage. "I've never exhibited any of these symptoms." "I know," James replied grimly, "but it gets worse. Harrison has also been in communication with a psychiatric evaluation service. They're planning to have you declared mentally incompetent within the next month. A psychiatric evaluation that would strip me of my legal rights, my ability to manage my own affairs, my control over my own life and death. Once declared incompetent, I would become a ward of my children, completely dependent on their care and completely vulnerable to their manipulation." But the most chilling discovery came when James showed me photographs of Michael's recent activities. "Your son has been meeting with someone else," James said, sliding photos across my desk. "Someone whose involvement changes everything about this situation." The photographs showed Michael sitting in a restaurant with a woman I didn't recognize, a well-dressed professional in her 50s with short silver hair and calculating eyes. "Her name is Victoria Chambers," James explained. "She's what they call an elder care specialist, but not the kind you'd want caring for anyone you love. She runs a network of assisted living facilities that specialize in managing the affairs of wealthy elderly clients." I felt my stomach drop. What kind of management? The kind where the elderly person signs over power of attorney, and then gradually their assets are transferred to care facilities and medical expenses until there's nothing left. Victoria has been investigated twice by state authorities, but she's careful. Her clients always die before anyone can prove wrongdoing. The full scope of their plan was now clear, and it was more sophisticated and more cruel than I had imagined. They weren't just planning to steal my money or wait for my natural death. They were planning to have me declared incompetent, place me in one of Victoria's facilities, and systematically drain my entire fortune while keeping me medicated and isolated from anyone who might help me. "How long do I have?" I asked James. "Based on what I've observed, they're planning to move within the next 2 weeks. Michael has already filled out the paperwork for the psychiatric evaluation. Sarah has been testing how you respond to the medications. Victoria has a room reserved at one of her facilities. 2 weeks to counter a conspiracy that had been months in the making. 2 weeks to save not just my money, but my life, my freedom, and my dignity." But as I sat in my study that evening, surrounded by evidence of my children's betrayal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of a legal battle that truly mattered. They had chosen to make war against me, but they had forgotten one crucial detail. I had spent 45 years winning wars that other people thought were unwinnable, and I had never lost a case when the stakes were this personal. The next phase of my counterattack would require allies, resources, and a level of strategic thinking that would make their conspiracy look like a children's game. But first, I needed to ensure they never suspected that their carefully planned trap was about to become their own prison. The following Monday morning, I made a decision that would either save my life or destroy what remained of my family forever. I called the one person I trusted more than anyone else in the legal world, my former law partner and closest friend, Patricia Morse. Patricia and I had built Wellington and Morse Law from nothing 40 years ago, becoming two of the most formidable estate attorneys in the state before she retired 5 years earlier. If anyone could help me navigate this nightmare, it was the woman who had stood beside me through 1,000 legal battles. "Margaret," Patricia said when I called, "you sound terrible. What's wrong?" "Patricia, I need your help with the most important case either of us has ever handled," I said. "And the client is me." When Patricia arrived at my house 2 hours later, she took one look at the evidence James had compiled, and her face went white. Patricia had seen every kind of family betrayal imaginable in our decades of practice, but even she was shaken by the scope of my children's conspiracy. "This isn't just elder abuse," she said, studying the medical records and financial documents. "This is attempted murder by 1,000 cuts. They're systematically destroying your legal standing, your financial security, and your physical health." Patricia's assessment was even more dire than I had realized. As she explained the legal implications of what my children were doing, I understood that their plan wasn't just sophisticated, It was nearly foolproof. If they succeed in having you declared mentally incompetent, Patricia warned, you'll lose all legal standing to challenge anything they've done. Every transaction they've made, every document they've forged, every medication they've given you becomes legally protected under their guardianship. But Patricia's horror quickly transformed into the same cold legal fury that had made us such effective partners. However, she continued, they've made several critical mistakes that we can exploit. She pulled out her laptop and began typing with the speed and precision of someone half her age. First, they've created a paper trail that actually proves premeditation. Every forged document, every fraudulent prescription, every meeting with Victoria Chambers is evidence of conspiracy. Patricia's plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Instead of trying to defend against my children's attacks, we would go on the offensive, using their own conspiracy against them. We're going to let them think they're winning, Patricia explained. We'll allow them to proceed with their plan, but every step they take will be documented, recorded, and preserved as evidence for criminal charges. She had already contacted Judge William Hartwell, an old friend from our court days who now handled probate and elder abuse cases. Judge Hartwell had agreed to seal court documents that would preserve evidence of the conspiracy while allowing it to continue under controlled circumstances. More importantly, Patricia said with a smile that reminded me why she had never lost a case in 30 years. I've been in touch with Detective Rachel Torres from the Elder Abuse Unit. She's been looking for a case exactly like this to make an example of people who prey on elderly family members. Detective Torres arrived at my house that evening, and her presence transformed what had felt like a hopeless situation into a winnable war. Torres was a woman in her 40s with the bearing of someone who had dedicated her career to protecting people like me. "Mrs. Wellington," she said, "what your children are doing isn't just morally reprehensible. It's a felony conspiracy that could send them to prison for 10 to 20 years each." Torres explained that elder abuse cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute because victims were often too compromised to testify effectively. But my case was different because I was still mentally competent and because the evidence was so comprehensive. "We're going to build a case that will become a textbook example of how to prosecute financial elder abuse," Torres said. "But we need your cooperation in allowing them to continue their activities while we document everything." The plan Torres and Patricia developed was both brilliant and terrifying. I would pretend to gradually succumb to the effects of their conspiracy. I would appear to become more confused, more dependent, more vulnerable. I would allow them to believe their plan was working while secretly recording every interaction, documenting every crime, and building an airtight case for their prosecution. "The key," Patricia explained, "is that we need them to commit the most serious crimes before we stop them. Financial fraud is serious, but attempted murder and conspiracy to commit elder abuse carries much heavier penalties." Torres installed recording equipment throughout my house, devices so small and sophisticated that they would capture every conversation, every phone call, every moment of their conspiracy. She also arranged for undercover surveillance of Michael's meetings with Victoria Chambers and Dr. Harrison. "Within 2 weeks," Torres said, "we'll have enough evidence to destroy them in both criminal and civil court." But the most important element of our counteroffensive wasn't legal, it was personal. Patricia had helped me draft a new will that would shock my children more than anything they could imagine. "Margaret," Patricia said, "after what they've done, you don't owe them anything." This new will reflects that reality. The new will was a masterpiece of legal strategy and poetic justice. Instead of leaving my fortune to the children who had betrayed me, I was establishing a foundation for elder abuse victims, funding legal aid for families facing similar conspiracies, and ensuring that my life's work would continue protecting people long after I was gone. "There's one more surprise," Patricia said with a smile. "I've arranged for the reading of this will to be broadcast live to your children via video conference. They'll learn about their disinheritance at exactly the moment they think they've won everything." As I signed the new will that evening, surrounded by legal allies who had become my family, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just hope for survival, but hope for justice, hope for vindication, and hope that my children's betrayal would ultimately serve a greater purpose. The trap was set. My children believed they were closing in on their victory, but they were actually walking deeper into a legal nightmare that would destroy their lives as thoroughly as they had tried to destroy mine. In less than 2 weeks, their champagne toast would become a funeral dirge for their freedom, their reputations, and their futures. They had taught me that blood means nothing when money is involved. Now I was going to teach them that justice is the only inheritance that truly matters. What I discovered in the following days made me realize that I had been fighting shadows while the real monster remained hidden. The conspiracy was far more extensive than even Detective Torres had suspected, and it involved people I had trusted with my life for years. James Crawford called me on Wednesday morning with a discovery that made my previous revelations seem like minor betrayals. His voice was shaking when he spoke. "Margaret, you need to sit down for this. What I've found, it changes everything we thought we knew about your situation." He arrived at my house within the hour, carrying a briefcase full of documents that would shatter what remained of my faith in human decency. But before he could speak, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Michael standing on my porch with a bouquet of flowers and that same false smile I had learned to recognize. "Quick," I whispered to James, "hide everything in the bedroom. I need to act normal." I opened the door to find Michael holding white lilies, flowers typically associated with funerals, and wearing an expression of exaggerated concern. "Mom, I've been worried about you," he said, kissing my cheek with lips that felt cold against my skin. "You seemed confused when Sarah visited yesterday." Confused. That was the word they were building their case around, the foundation of their plan to destroy my competency. But as Michael settled into my living room, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. He was recording our conversation. I could see the small device clipped to his jacket, barely visible, but unmistakably a recording device. Every word I said, every reaction I had, was being documented to support their claims of my mental decline. "Michael, that's a beautiful recording device you're wearing," I said casually, watching his face drain of color. For a moment, his carefully constructed facade cracked, and I saw the real Michael, calculating, cold, and caught. But he recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a death rattle. "Mom, I think you're seeing things. Maybe we should call Dr. Harrison to check on you." "Oh, I think Dr. Harrison has done quite enough checking already," I replied, letting just enough edge into my voice to make him uncomfortable. After Michael left, hastily, without the usual small talk, James emerged from hiding with revelations that made the conspiracy even more sinister. "Margaret, your children aren't working alone, and this isn't their first attempt at this kind of scheme," James said, opening his briefcase with trembling hands. The documents he showed me revealed a network of corruption that stretched back years. Victoria Chambers, the woman Michael had been meeting with, wasn't just running questionable assisted living facilities. She was the center of an interstate elder abuse ring that had been operating for over a decade. "Victoria has done this before," James explained. "Multiple times, in multiple states. She targets wealthy elderly individuals with adult children who are already struggling financially or who have gambling debts, drug problems, or other vulnerabilities that make them susceptible to her influence." The photographs James had taken showed meetings between Victoria, Michael, Sarah, and 3 other adult children from different families where elderly parents had died under mysterious circumstances after signing over their assets to care facilities. "This is a criminal enterprise," James continued, "and your children are just her latest recruits." But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. James showed me financial records that proved Dr. Harrison's involvement went back much further than we had realized. "Dr. Harrison has been part of Victoria's network for 7 years, James said. He's facilitated the deaths of at least 12 elderly patients by prescribing incorrect medications, documenting false mental health deterioration, and providing medical cover for what amounts to murder. Murder. The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud. My children weren't just trying to steal my money. They were part of a network that had killed other parents, other families, other lives. "There's more," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found communications between Sarah and Victoria dating back to when your husband Robert was still alive. The documents he showed me were like looking into the depths of hell. Sarah had been in contact with Victoria for over 5 years, initially asking about options for elderly parents who were becoming burdensome. The correspondence revealed that they had considered trying their scheme on Robert before his cancer diagnosis made it unnecessary. "They were planning to kill your husband," James said, "but cancer saved them the trouble." I sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what I was learning. My children hadn't just turned against me after Robert's death. They had been planning our murders for years, waiting for the right opportunity, the right moment when they could execute their plan without suspicion. Detective Torres arrived that evening after James called her with his discoveries. Her expression was grimmer than I had ever seen it. "Mrs. Wellington," she said, "what we're dealing with here isn't just elder abuse, it's a multi-state criminal conspiracy involving serial murder. The FBI is now involved, and they want to use your case to bring down the entire network." FBI Special Agent Maria Santos joined our meeting via video conference from the Bureau's white-collar crime division. Agent Santos was a woman who had spent her career dismantling criminal conspiracies, and her assessment of our situation was both reassuring and terrifying. "Mrs. Wellington, you're not just a victim. You're the key to stopping a criminal organization that has murdered at least 15 elderly individuals across 4 states," Agent Santos said. "But that also means you're in more immediate danger than we initially realized." The FBI's investigation had been tracking Victoria's network for 2 years, but they had never been able to get close enough to document the conspiracy in action. My case represented their best opportunity to gather evidence and save future victims. "We need you to continue playing your role," Agent Santos explained, "but we're going to provide you with federal protection. Agents will be monitoring your house 24 hours a day, and we're going to accelerate the timeline for bringing down the network." Patricia, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke. "Margaret, this has gone far beyond anything we anticipated. You're not just fighting for your inheritance, you're fighting to expose a criminal empire." As the meeting concluded and our allies prepared to leave, I realized that my personal battle for justice had become something much larger. I wasn't just seeking revenge against my children. I was participating in a federal investigation that could save countless other families from the horror I was experiencing. But the knowledge that I was part of something larger didn't diminish the personal pain. My children weren't just greedy or impatient. They were accomplices to murder, willing participants in a scheme that had killed other parents, other families who had trusted and loved their children, just as I had trusted and loved mine. The trap we were setting was no longer just about my inheritance or my children's betrayal. It was about stopping a network of killers who preyed on the most vulnerable members of society. And in less than a week, when they made their final move to have me declared incompetent and transferred to Victoria's facility, they would walk directly into the arms of federal agents who had been waiting years for this moment. My children thought they were just a few days away from collecting millions of dollars and eliminating the mother who had become inconvenient to their plans. Instead, they were just a few days away from life sentences in federal prison. The weekend before what my children believed would be their ultimate victory, I received a visit that crystallized everything I needed to understand about the magnitude of their evil. Victoria Chambers herself came to my door, accompanied by Sarah, both wearing expressions of false compassion that made my skin crawl. "Mrs. Wellington," Victoria said, her voice smooth as poisoned honey, "your daughter has told me so much about your recent struggles. I'm here to help." I played my role perfectly, acting confused and slightly disoriented while FBI recording equipment captured every word of what would become a key piece of evidence in their prosecution. "I understand you've been having some memory issues," Victoria continued, settling into my living room as if she already owned it. "I run specialized facilities that cater to women of your particular needs." Particular needs. The euphemism they used for wealthy elderly women they planned to murder after stealing their fortunes. Victoria pulled out a tablet and began showing me photographs of what she called Serenity Gardens, a facility that looked more like a luxury resort than the death trap I now knew it to be. "We provide round-the-clock medical care," she said, swiping through images of beautifully appointed rooms and smiling staff members. "Many of our residents find that the structured environment helps them feel more secure as they transition through this difficult phase of life." Transition through this difficult phase of life. another euphemism for the systematic drugging and eventual murder that awaited anyone who entered her facility. Sarah sat beside me, playing the role of concerned daughter with an Oscar-worthy performance. "Mom, I think this might be exactly what you need. You've been so confused lately, and I worry about you living alone in this big house." I allowed myself to appear interested, even grateful for their concern, while inside I was documenting every detail for the federal case that would destroy them. "The best part," Victoria said, "is that we handle all the financial arrangements. You won't need to worry about managing your assets anymore. We take care of everything through our comprehensive estate management service." Their comprehensive estate management service that would transfer my entire fortune into their accounts while I was slowly poisoned to death in a luxury prison. After they left, FBI agent Santos debriefed me via secure video link from the command center they had established to monitor the operation. "That was perfect, Mrs. Wellington," she said. "Victoria just confessed to conspiracy to commit elder abuse and financial fraud on federal surveillance equipment. Combined with the evidence we already have, we now have enough to prosecute the entire network." Agent Santos explained that similar operations were being conducted simultaneously in 3 other states, targeting the other families Victoria's network had been grooming for their scheme. "On Tuesday, when they move to have you transferred to the facility, we'll arrest the entire network simultaneously," she said. "Victoria, your children, Dr. Harrison, and 8 other conspirators across 4 states will be taken into custody at the same time." Patricia had been working around the clock to ensure that the legal aspects of our counteroffensive were flawless. The new will she had helped me draft wasn't just about disinheriting my children. It was about creating a lasting legacy that would help other families avoid the nightmare I was experiencing. "Margaret," Patricia said during our final strategy meeting, "the Margaret Wellington Foundation for Elder Protection will be funded with your entire estate. It will provide legal aid, investigation services, and support for families dealing with elder abuse. The foundation would be announced at the same moment my children discovered their disinheritance, ensuring that their betrayal would ultimately serve to protect other families from similar conspiracies." Detective Torres had coordinated with local law enforcement to ensure that my children's arrests would be conducted with maximum impact. Both Michael and Sarah would be arrested at their homes in front of their families, their neighbors, their communities that had respected them as successful professionals and devoted children. "Your son's law firm has already been notified that he's under federal investigation," Torres told me. "His partners have suspended him pending the outcome of the case. Your daughter's real estate license is being revoked by the state board." But perhaps the most satisfying element of our preparation was the surprise I had arranged for Dr. Harrison. Patricia had contacted the state medical board with evidence of his involvement in the conspiracy, and his medical license had been suspended pending a full investigation. "Dr. Harrison received the suspension notice this morning," Patricia reported with evident satisfaction. "His practice is being audited, and investigators are reviewing the suspicious deaths of 12 patients under his care." As Sunday evening arrived and I prepared for what would be the final act of this nightmare, I reflected on how completely the tables had turned. My children thought they were hours away from their greatest triumph, but they were actually hours away from their complete destruction. I had learned something profound during this ordeal. Betrayal by those we love most doesn't just wound us, it can transform us into something stronger, more determined, more capable of justice than we ever imagined possible. Tuesday morning would bring federal agents to my door, ostensibly to evaluate my mental competence, but actually to arrest the conspirators who thought they were finally claiming their prize. Victoria would arrive expecting to transfer me to her facility of death, but instead she would be transferred to a federal holding cell. Michael and Sarah would wake up believing this was the day they would inherit millions of dollars. Instead, it would be the day they learned that their inheritance was a life sentence in federal prison. The champagne toast they had raised to my anticipated death would be remembered as the moment they celebrated their own destruction. In trying to steal my life, they had given me the opportunity to save countless other lives and create a legacy more powerful than any fortune. As I prepared for sleep on my last night as their intended victim, I smiled for the first time in months. Tomorrow, justice would finally be served, and my children would learn the most expensive lesson of their lives. that some inheritances can never be stolen and some mothers should never be underestimated. The war was almost over, and I had already won. Monday night, I barely slept, not from fear, but from anticipation. After months of being hunted by my own children, tomorrow would finally bring justice. The federal operation was so comprehensive, so perfectly orchestrated, that even I was amazed by what we had accomplished. At 6 a.m, my phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Today's the day, Mom. Everything will be easier after this, I promise." If he only knew how prophetic those words were. Agent Santos called at 7 to give me the final briefing. "Mrs. Wellington, we have agents positioned at 14 locations across 4 states. This is the largest elder abuse takedown in FBI history, and it all started with your courage to fight back." The scale of the operation was staggering. Victoria's network had been targeting wealthy elderly individuals in California, Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado. The FBI had identified 43 victims over the past 8 years, people who had died under suspicious circumstances after signing over their assets to Victoria's care facilities. "Your children don't know it yet," Agent Santos continued, "but they're about to become the face of elder abuse in America. This case will be studied in law schools and medical schools for decades." Patricia arrived at 8 with final documents and one last surprise that would make my revenge complete. "Margaret, I've arranged for something special," she said with the smile of someone who had just delivered the perfect knockout punch. "The reading of your will is going to be broadcast live, not just to your children, but to every major news network in the country. The Margaret Wellington Foundation would be announced to the world at the same moment my children learned they had been disinherited. Their greed and betrayal would become a national story, ensuring that their shame would follow them for the rest of their lives. More importantly," Patricia added, "I've arranged for 3 other families whose parents were murdered by this network to be present at the will reading. Your children will have to face the relatives of people they helped kill." At 9 o'clock, Dr. Harrison arrived for what he believed was a routine visit to document my mental decline. He had no idea that FBI agents were watching his every move, recording his every word, building the case that would end his career and his freedom. "Mrs. Wellington," he said, his voice oily with false concern, "I need to ask you some questions about your memory and cognitive function." I played along perfectly, giving answers that were slightly confused, but not completely incoherent, exactly what Victoria's network needed to justify my transfer to their facility. "I've been having trouble remembering things," I said, watching Dr. Harrison make notes that would be used as evidence of his fraud. "Sometimes I forget where I put things, or what day it is." "That's very concerning," Dr. Harrison replied, though I could see satisfaction in his eyes. "I think we need to discuss some changes to your living situation." After he left, Detective Torres confirmed that they had recorded him coaching me toward answers that supported their conspiracy. "Dr. Harrison just committed perjury and medical fraud on federal surveillance equipment," she said. "He's going to prison for a very long time." At 11, Sarah arrived with Victoria and 2 men I didn't recognize, orderlies from the facility who were there to escort me to what they believed would be my final destination. "Mom, we're here to help you move to a place where you'll be more comfortable," Sarah said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Victoria was all business, pulling out legal documents that would transfer power of attorney and complete control of my assets to my children. "Mrs. Wellington, if you could just sign these papers, we can get you settled into your new home today," Victoria said, placing the documents in front of me with practiced efficiency. I pretended to be confused by the papers, asking questions that allowed them to explain their scheme in detail while FBI recording equipment captured every word. "This paper means Michael and Sarah will take care of all your money worries," Victoria explained patiently. "You won't have to think about finances anymore. And this one," Sarah added, pointing to another document, "means we can make medical decisions for you when you're not feeling well. Medical decisions that would include authorizing the cocktail of drugs that would slowly kill me while appearing to be natural decline." I was about to sign the papers, giving the FBI their final piece of evidence, when my doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see federal agents approaching my house, their badges clearly visible. Victoria's face went white. "Who is that?" "I don't know," I said innocently. "Should I answer it?" Agent Santos knocked on the door with the authority of someone who had been waiting months for this moment. FBI, we have warrants for the arrest of Victoria Chambers, Sarah Wellington Morris, and Michael Wellington. The chaos that followed was more satisfying than anything I could have imagined. Victoria tried to run, but agents were positioned at every exit. Sarah collapsed into hysterical tears, screaming that there had been some mistake. Michael attempted to destroy his phone, not realizing that the FBI had been monitoring all his communications for weeks. Victoria Chambers, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder, Agent Santos announced as she placed handcuffs on the woman who had planned my death. Sarah Wellington Morris, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder abuse, financial fraud, and attempted murder of a family member. Michael Wellington, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder abuse, financial fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and racketeering. As my children were led away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete and total vindication. They had tried to steal my life, my money, and my dignity. Instead, they had handed me the greatest victory of my legal career. Detective Torres approached me as the last of the conspirators was loaded into federal vehicles. Mrs. Wellington, it's over. The entire network has been dismantled. 14 arrests across 4 states, and it all started with your courage to fight back. But the most satisfying moment was yet to come. In exactly 1 hour, the will reading would begin, broadcast live to newsrooms across the country. My children would learn not only that they had been disinherited, but that their greed had funded the very foundation that would work to prevent other families from experiencing what they had put me through. The trap had been set perfectly, and they had walked into it exactly as we had planned. Tomorrow, they would wake up in federal holding cells, facing life sentences for their crimes. I would wake up in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by the respect and admiration of a grateful nation. Justice, it turned out, was the sweetest inheritance of all. As the FBI vehicles disappeared down my street, carrying my children to their new reality, I had exactly 1 hour to prepare for the moment I had been anticipating for months. The public reading of my will that would expose the full scope of their betrayal to the world. Patricia had arranged for the will reading to take place in the grand conference room of our old law firm, a space where I had won countless battles, but none as personal or as important as this one. Major news networks had been tipped off about the significance of the event, the first public will reading connected to the largest elder abuse conspiracy in FBI history. But first, I had one final revelation that would make this victory complete. James Crawford arrived with documents that represented the culmination of his investigation, evidence that would ensure my children's sentences would be measured in decades, not years. "Margaret," he said, his voice filled with the satisfaction of someone who had solved the most complex case of his career, "I found something that changes everything we thought we knew about your children's motivations." The documents he showed me revealed that Michael and Sarah's betrayal went back much further than anyone had suspected. They had been planning this conspiracy since before Robert's death, but not because they were impatient about their inheritance. They were desperate because they had already stolen most of it. "Your children have been embezzling from your accounts for over 3 years, James explained, showing me financial records that made my head spin. Between gambling debts, failed business ventures, and lifestyle expenses they couldn't afford, they had already taken over $2 million. $2 million stolen gradually, expertly hidden through a network of shell companies and false business expenses that had escaped detection until James's investigation uncovered the paper trail. They weren't trying to kill you for your money," James continued. "They were trying to kill you to cover up the money they had already stolen." The full picture was now clear, and it was more damning than I could have imagined. My children hadn't just become criminals. They had been criminals for years, using my trust and love to fund their failures while planning my murder to escape the consequences. "There's more," James said, pulling out another set of documents. "I found communications between Michael and a life insurance company. He took out a policy on your life 6 months ago without your knowledge. A $2 million life insurance policy that would have covered their theft and provided additional profit from my death. They hadn't just been planning to steal my estate. They had been planning to profit from my murder." I looked at the documents in stunned silence, processing the full magnitude of their deception. These weren't children who had been corrupted by Victoria's influence. These were accomplished criminals who had found Victoria because they needed her expertise to complete a crime they had been planning for years. At 1 o'clock, I arrived at the law firm for the will reading that would conclude this nightmare. The conference room was packed with reporters, federal agents, and 3 families whose elderly relatives had been murdered by Victoria's network. Patricia stood at the head of the table with the authority of someone who had spent 40 years mastering these moments. Beside her was a large screen that would broadcast the reading live to newsrooms across the country. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia began, "we are here for the reading of the last will and testament of Margaret Elizabeth Wellington, a document that will establish the Margaret Wellington Foundation for Elder Protection and expose one of the most heinous criminal conspiracies in recent memory." The will reading was a masterpiece of legal theater and poetic justice. As Patricia read each section, the full scope of my children's betrayal was revealed to a national audience. "To my son Michael Wellington and my daughter Sarah Wellington Morris," Patricia read with perfect dramatic timing, "who conspired to murder me for financial gain, who stole over $2 million from my accounts, and who participated in a criminal network that murdered 15 elderly Americans. I leave nothing." The gasps from the assembled reporters were audible. This wasn't just a disinheritance. It was a public condemnation that would follow my children for the rest of their lives. "Instead," Patricia continued, "my entire estate, valued at approximately $12 million, will fund the Margaret Wellington Foundation for Elder Protection, which will provide legal aid, investigation services, and support for families dealing with elder abuse." But the most powerful moment came when Patricia introduced the families of Victoria's other victims, people whose parents, grandparents, and spouses had been murdered by the same network my children had joined. Eleanor Martinez stood up with tears in her eyes. "My mother Rosa was murdered by these people 2 years ago. She died alone and afraid in one of their facilities while they stole everything she had worked her entire life to build." Robert Chen spoke next, his voice shaking with emotion. "My father trusted the people who killed him. He signed papers he thought would help him, and instead, they drugged him to death while stealing his life savings." One by one, the families spoke about their loved ones, 15 people who had died because of the network my children had chosen to join. The weight of their testimony made it clear that this case was about much more than my personal betrayal. As the will reading concluded, Patricia made an announcement that surprised even me. "The Margaret Wellington Foundation has already received its first donation," she said with a smile. "The life insurance policy that Michael Wellington fraudulently obtained will pay its benefits not to him, but to the foundation he tried to defraud." The final irony was perfect. The insurance policy my son had planned to use to profit from my death would instead fund the organization dedicated to preventing other families from suffering as we had. As the media dispersed to report on what would become front-page news across the country, I sat alone in the conference room where I had spent so many years fighting for justice. This time, the justice was personal, complete, and absolutely final. My children had awakened that morning believing they were about to inherit millions of dollars. Instead, they had inherited life sentences, national shame, and the knowledge that their betrayal had ultimately created something that would protect other families for generations to come. The champagne toast they had raised to my early departure had become their own farewell to freedom, to respect, to any hope of redemption. They had chosen greed over love, murder over compassion, betrayal over loyalty. Now they would spend the rest of their lives paying for those choices, while the mother they had tried to kill would spend the rest of hers ensuring that no other family would suffer as we had. Justice had been served with interest, and the account was finally balanced. The most difficult moment of this entire nightmare came 3 days after my children's arrest, when they were allowed visitors at the federal holding facility. Against the advice of everyone who cared about me, I decided I needed to see them one final time, not to forgive, but to ensure they understood the full consequences of their choices. The visiting room at the Federal Detention Center was a sterile, heartless place that seemed appropriate for what had become of our family. When Michael and Sarah were brought in wearing orange jumpsuits and shackles, I barely recognized the people I had raised with such love and hope. Sarah looked broken, her hair unwashed, and her eyes red from crying. Michael appeared defiant, though I could see fear beneath his anger. They sat across from me at a metal table, separated by a distance that felt infinite. "Mom," Sarah began, her voice cracking, "this is all a terrible mistake. We were just trying to help you." "Stop," I said quietly, cutting off what would have been another lie. "We're past the point of deception, Sarah. I know everything." I pulled out a folder containing copies of all the evidence James had gathered. Every document, every photograph, every piece of proof of their conspiracy. "I know about the stolen $2 million, I continued, watching their faces drain of color. "I know about the life insurance policy. I know about your meetings with Victoria Chambers going back 5 years. I know about your plans to murder your father before cancer did it for you." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in years, my children had no lies, no excuses, no manipulations to offer. Michael was the first to speak, and his words revealed the depth of his corruption. "You don't understand the pressure we were under," he said, his voice filled with self-pity rather than remorse. "The debts, the expectations, the way you and Dad always made us feel like we could never measure up." I stared at my son with something approaching wonder. Even now, facing life in prison for conspiracy to commit murder, he was trying to make himself the victim. "So your solution was to steal from us and then kill us?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm despite the storm of emotions inside me. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Sarah said through her tears. "Victoria told us it would be peaceful, that you wouldn't suffer. She said elderly people die in facilities all the time, and no one questions it. Peaceful. As if the method of murder somehow mitigated the crime of murdering your own mother." "Sarah," I said, looking into the eyes of the daughter I had once loved more than my own life, "you were planning to drug me to death while stealing everything I had worked my entire life to build. You were going to watch me die alone and afraid while you celebrated your inheritance." "We didn't have a choice," Michael exploded, his facade of composure finally cracking. "Do you know what it's like to have everyone expect you to be successful when your parents have already achieved everything? Do you know the pressure of living up to that?" I looked at my son, this man I had supported through law school, whose failures I had covered, whose debts I had paid without question, and felt nothing but pity for the pathetic creature he had become. "Michael," I said with deadly calm, "millions of people face pressure and disappointment without resorting to murdering their parents. Your failures don't justify attempted murder." The conversation that followed revealed the full extent of their moral bankruptcy. They blamed me for their financial problems, claiming that my success had created unrealistic expectations. They blamed their father for not leaving them more money when he died. They blamed society for not appreciating their talents. They blamed everyone except themselves for the choices that had led them to this moment. "The foundation you created," Sarah said, her voice turning bitter. "You're making us into examples, turning our family tragedy into a public spectacle." "No, Sarah," I replied. "You made yourselves into examples when you chose to join a criminal network that murders elderly people for money. I'm simply ensuring that your crimes serve a purpose beyond your own greed." I pulled out the final document I had brought, a letter I had written but hoped I would never need to send. "This is a statement I'm releasing to the media tomorrow," I said, placing it on the table between us. "It explains how 2 children I loved and trusted became accomplices to murder, and how their betrayal led to the creation of a foundation that will protect other families from similar tragedies." As they read the letter, I watched the last traces of defiance leave their faces. The letter was compassionate but unflinching, detailing their crimes while expressing my heartbreak as a mother who had lost her children to greed and evil. "You're destroying us," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I replied, standing to leave. "You destroyed yourselves. I'm simply ensuring that your destruction serves a greater purpose." As I walked toward the exit, Sarah called out one final time, "Mom, please, we're still your children." "Doesn't that mean anything?" I stopped at the door and turned back to look at them one last time. These strangers wearing the faces of the children I had once loved. "You stopped being my children the moment you decided to murder me," I said with quiet finality. "You're criminals now, and you'll be treated as such." The drive home from the detention center was the longest of my life. I had needed to see them, to confirm that there was no redemption possible, no path back to the family we had once been. What I found instead was the complete absence of remorse, the total lack of accountability that confirmed every decision I had made. They would spend the next 30 to 40 years in federal prison, thinking about the choices that had led them there. I would spend whatever years I had left ensuring that other families never experienced the betrayal, the heartbreak, the fundamental violation of trust that had destroyed ours. The confrontation was over. The war was won. All that remained was to build something meaningful from the ashes of what had once been my family. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles became the center of national attention as the trial of Victoria Chambers and her co-conspirators began. What the media had dubbed the trial of the century would expose the full scope of the elder abuse network and deliver justice for 15 murdered victims and their families. I sat in the front row of the courtroom gallery, no longer the intended victim, but the star witness whose courage had brought down an entire criminal empire. Beside me sat the families of Victoria's other victims, people who had become my extended family through shared tragedy and the pursuit of justice. Federal prosecutor Jennifer Walsh had built her career on complex conspiracy cases, but even she admitted that this case was unprecedented in its scope and cruelty. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Prosecutor Walsh began in her opening statement, over the next 3 weeks, you will hear evidence of a criminal conspiracy so calculated, so heartless, and so extensive that it will challenge your faith in human decency. But you will also hear a story of courage, justice, and how one woman's refusal to be a victim saved countless other families from experiencing the same nightmare. The prosecution's case was devastating in its completeness. Agent Santos testified about the FBI's investigation, detailing how Victoria's network had operated across 4 states for 8 years. Dr. Harrison, who had already pleaded guilty in exchange for cooperation, testified about his role in falsifying medical records and prescribing lethal drug combinations. But the most powerful testimony came from the families of Victoria's victims. One by one, they took the stand to describe how their loved ones had died, isolated, confused, and afraid, while their assets were systematically stolen. When my turn came to testify, the courtroom was silent, except for the scratching of reporters' pens and the quiet sobbing of family members reliving their own tragedies. Mrs. Wellington, Prosecutor Walsh began, please tell the court how you first discovered that your children were planning to murder you. For 2 hours, I recounted the entire nightmare, from the champagne toast to the discovery of the conspiracy, to the moment federal agents arrested my children. My testimony was clinical, factual, and devastating. But the moment that shocked even the experienced courtroom observers came when Prosecutor Walsh played the recording of Victoria explaining her comprehensive estate management service while sitting in my living room. Victoria's voice filled the courtroom. You won't need to worry about managing your assets anymore. We take care of everything through our comprehensive estate management service. The euphemisms she had used to describe systematic theft and murder sounded even more chilling when played back to a jury that now understood their true meaning. The defense attorneys tried desperately to paint Victoria as a legitimate businesswoman who had been misunderstood, and my children as loving offspring who had simply been manipulated by a master criminal. But the evidence was overwhelming, and their attempts at defense only made their clients appear more callous. Michael's attorney actually argued that my son had been emotionally damaged by growing up with successful parents and therefore couldn't be held fully responsible for his actions. The jury's expression of disgust made it clear how that argument was being received. Sarah's lawyer tried a different approach, claiming that her hormonal changes due to menopause had affected her judgment. The prosecutor's response was swift and merciless. "Are you seriously arguing," Prosecutor Walsh asked during cross-examination, "that menopause is a valid defense for conspiracy to commit murder?" The trial's most dramatic moment came when Victoria herself took the stand in her own defense. It was a catastrophic mistake that sealed her fate and the fate of all her co-conspirators. Under cross-examination, Victoria revealed the full extent of her sociopathy. She showed no remorse for the 15 people who had died under her care, referring to them as clients who had completed their life cycle and describing their deaths as natural transitions facilitated by professional care. "Mrs. Chambers," Prosecutor Walsh asked, "do you feel any responsibility for the deaths of these 15 elderly individuals?" "I provided them with comfort and dignity in their final days," Victoria replied with stunning arrogance. "Their families should be grateful for the service I provided." The courtroom erupted. Family members of her victims had to be restrained as they reacted to Victoria's complete lack of humanity. Even the judge looked shaken by her callousness. When the prosecutor played recordings of Victoria instructing my children on how to gradually increase my medication dosages to ensure a peaceful transition, several jury members were visibly ill. The defense phase of the trial was mercifully brief. Michael and Sarah's attorneys realized that putting their clients on the stand would only make things worse. Victoria's testimony had already demonstrated the depths of the conspiracy's evil, and anything my children said would only confirm their willing participation. During closing arguments, Prosecutor Walsh delivered what legal observers called one of the most powerful summations in federal court history. "This case is about more than money," she told the jury. "It's about the fundamental trust that binds families together, the sacred bond between parents and children, and the special vulnerability of our elderly citizens. The defendants didn't just commit crimes. They violated the most basic principles of human decency." She pointed to where I sat in the gallery. Margaret Wellington had every reason to despair when she discovered her children's betrayal. Instead, she chose to fight back, not just for herself, but for every elderly person who might face similar betrayal. Her courage has saved lives and exposed a criminal network that would have continued killing innocent people. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, remarkably fast for such a complex case. When they returned, their verdict was swift and unanimous, guilty on all charges for all defendants. Victoria Chambers was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Michael received 45 years in federal prison. Sarah received 40 years. Dr. Harrison, who had cooperated with the prosecution, received 25 years. As the sentences were read, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: complete and final closure. The people who had tried to steal my life, my dignity, and my legacy would spend the rest of their lives paying for their crimes. Outside the courthouse, I was surrounded by reporters asking for my reaction to the verdicts. "Justice has been served," I said simply. "But more importantly, this case has exposed a type of crime that targets our most vulnerable citizens. The Margaret Wellington Foundation will ensure that other families have the resources to protect themselves from similar betrayals." That evening, I returned to my house, the same house where my children had toasted my anticipated death, where they had planned my murder, where I had discovered the depths of their betrayal. But now it felt different. It felt like home again, a place where justice lived and where love had been replaced by something far more powerful: purpose. The trial was over, but my real work was just beginning. 1 year after the trial that had captivated the nation, I stood before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee to testify in support of the Elder Protection Act, federal legislation inspired by my case that would strengthen penalties for elder abuse and provide better resources for victims and their families. The hearing room was packed with senators, advocates, and families who had experienced similar betrayals. What had begun as my personal nightmare had become a national movement for protecting elderly Americans from the people who should love them most. "Mrs. Wellington," Committee Chairman Senator Patricia Hayes began, "your courage in exposing this criminal network has saved countless lives and changed how our nation addresses elder abuse. Can you tell us what you've learned about the scope of this problem?" I looked out at the assembled senators and felt the weight of representing not just my own experience, but the experiences of thousands of families who had suffered in silence. "Senator Hayes," I began, "what I learned is that elder abuse is not an aberration. It's an epidemic. The FBI estimates that for every case like mine that gets exposed, there are 50 others that remain hidden. Adult children steal from their parents at a rate of over $5 billion annually, and most of it is never reported because victims are too ashamed or too afraid to seek help." The statistics I presented were staggering. The Margaret Wellington Foundation had received over 12,000 calls in its first year of operation from elderly individuals who suspected they were being financially abused by family members. Of those cases, nearly 3,000 involved criminal activity that warranted federal investigation. "What we discovered," I continued, is that networks like Victoria Chambers Operation exist in every state. They prey on the fundamental trust between parents and children, exploiting love and family bonds to commit the most heinous crimes imaginable. Senator Robert Martinez, whose own mother had been a victim of financial elder abuse, asked the question that cut to the heart of the issue. Mrs. Wellington, how do we protect elderly Americans when the threat comes from within their own families? Senator Martinez, I replied, we protect them the same way we protect any vulnerable population, through education, resources, and laws that make the consequences of elder abuse so severe that potential perpetrators think twice before acting. The Elder Protection Act I was supporting would establish federal elder abuse courts, mandate reporting of suspicious financial transactions involving elderly individuals, and create a national database to track patterns of abuse across state lines. But the most important provision was one I had insisted upon: the creation of federal funding for organizations like my foundation that could provide immediate legal and investigative support for elderly victims. Too many elderly Americans discover they're being abused only after it's too late to recover their assets or protect themselves, I testified. This legislation would ensure that help is available before the theft becomes murder. After my testimony, I was approached by Dorothy Chen, an 82-year-old woman whose grandson had stolen her life savings to fund a gambling addiction. Mrs. Wellington, she said, tears in her eyes, watching you fight back gave me the courage to report my own grandson. Because of your foundation's legal aid program, I was able to recover most of my money and see him prosecuted. Stories like Dorothy's had become commonplace. The foundation received dozens of letters every week from elderly individuals who had found the strength to fight back after hearing about my case. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source: other adult children who were struggling with elderly parents and financial pressures. Rebecca Santos, a middle-aged woman caring for her mother with dementia, approached me after the hearing. Mrs. Wellington, she said, your story scared me because I recognized some of my own thoughts in what your children did. When I was struggling to pay for my mother's care, I considered using her savings without permission. Your case made me realize how easily good people can cross lines they never thought they would cross. Rebecca's honesty revealed something important about elder abuse. It wasn't always the result of inherent evil, but often the consequence of desperation, poor judgment, and the gradual erosion of moral boundaries. The foundation had begun offering counseling and support services not just for victims, but for adult children who were struggling with the pressures of caring for aging parents. We've learned, I told the Senate committee, that prevention is often more effective than prosecution. When families have resources and support, they're less likely to make the catastrophic choices that destroy lives and relationships. 3 months after the Senate hearing, the Elder Protection Act passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. President Martinez signed it into law in a ceremony attended by dozens of elder abuse survivors and their families. But the most satisfying moment of the entire year came when I received a letter from the Federal Bureau of Prisons informing me that my children had requested permission to write to me. I declined. Some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. Some betrayals are so fundamental that forgiveness becomes not just impossible, but inadvisable. My children had made their choices, and they would live with the consequences for the rest of their lives. That evening, I sat in my study, the same room where I had first discovered evidence of their conspiracy, and reflected on how completely my life had changed. A year ago, I had been a victim, isolated and afraid, facing what seemed like certain death at the hands of people I loved. Now I was the face of a national movement, the founder of an organization that had helped thousands of families, and the driving force behind federal legislation that would protect elderly Americans for generations to come. The house that had once felt like a tomb now felt like a command center for justice. The children who had tried to steal my legacy had instead inspired me to create a legacy far more powerful than any inheritance. I had learned something profound during this journey. Betrayal doesn't have to destroy us. It can transform us into something stronger, more purposeful, more capable of making a difference than we ever imagined possible. My children had tried to end my story. Instead, they had given me the opportunity to write the most important chapter of my life. 5 years have passed since that terrible evening when I overheard my children toasting my anticipated death. As I sit in my study this morning, surrounded by letters from families we've helped and awards from organizations dedicated to protecting elderly Americans, I can honestly say that their betrayal became the greatest gift of my life. The Margaret Wellington Foundation has grown beyond anything I could have imagined. We now operate in all 50 states with a staff of over 200 attorneys, investigators, and counselors dedicated to protecting elderly Americans from family betrayal. We've helped recover over $100 million in stolen assets and prevented countless tragedies like the one that nearly destroyed my life. Last month, I received a letter that moved me to tears. It was from Maria Rodriguez, a 78-year-old woman in Texas whose son had been slowly poisoning her while stealing her pension money. Our foundation's hotline helped her recognize the signs of abuse. Our investigators gathered evidence of the crimes, and our attorneys helped prosecute her son and recover her assets. "Mrs. Wellington," Maria wrote, "your story saved my life. When I heard about what happened to you and how you fought back, I realized I didn't have to be a victim. Because of your foundation, I'm alive, I'm safe, and I'm helping other mothers who are facing what we both survived." Stories like Maria's remind me why I made the choices I did. Every dollar my children tried to steal, every day they tried to cut short, every moment of dignity they tried to rob from me has been transformed into protection for other families. But the foundation is only part of my legacy. The Elder Protection Act has fundamentally changed how our nation addresses family betrayal of elderly individuals. In the 5 years since its passage, federal prosecutions of elder abuse have increased by 400%, and the average sentence for these crimes has tripled. More importantly, the cultural conversation about elder abuse has shifted dramatically. What was once a hidden shame that families endured in silence has become a recognized crime that society actively fights against. Dr. Harrison died in prison 3 years ago, his medical license revoked, and his reputation destroyed. Victoria Chambers will spend the rest of her life behind bars, her network of death dismantled, and her victims finally vindicated. My children remain in federal prison, and according to the reports I receive, they have become model prisoners who spend their time counseling other inmates about the consequences of family betrayal. I have never responded to their requests for contact, and I never will. Some wounds are too deep for healing, some betrayals too fundamental for forgiveness. But I have found peace in knowing that their crime has been transformed into a force for good that will protect families long after I'm gone. Last week, I celebrated my 76th birthday. 5 years older than my children expected me to live. The celebration was held at the Foundation's headquarters, surrounded by people who have become my chosen family. Patricia, who continues to serve as the Foundation's chief legal counsel. Detective Torres, who now heads our investigative division. Agent Santos, who directs our federal liaison program, and dozens of families whose lives have been saved by the work we do together. As I blew out the candles on my birthday cake, I thought about the champagne toast my children had raised to my early departure. They had no idea they were celebrating the birth of something far more powerful than they could have imagined. I have spent my life believing that justice delayed is justice denied. But I've learned that sometimes justice isn't just about punishment. It's about transformation. The evil that my children planned has been transformed into a good that protects thousands of families. Their betrayal has become other families' salvation. People often ask me if I regret having children, if I wish I had never experienced the heartbreak of their betrayal. The answer is always the same. I regret their choices, but I'm grateful for the opportunity those choices gave me to serve something larger than myself. I am no longer just Margaret Wellington, the woman whose children tried to murder her for money. I am Margaret Wellington, the woman who fought back and created a legacy that will protect elderly Americans for generations to come. My biological children are gone, lost to greed and evil that I still struggle to understand. But I have thousands of adopted children now, elderly Americans who are safer because of the work we do, families who are stronger because of the resources we provide, communities that are more aware because of the conversations we've started. At 76, I am more alive, more purposeful, and more fulfilled than I have ever been. The inheritance my children tried to steal has become an inheritance for all of America's elderly, protection, dignity, and justice for those who deserve nothing less. Tomorrow, I begin writing my memoir, not just the story of my family's betrayal, but the story of how betrayal can be transformed into purpose, how victims can become victors, and how the darkest chapters of our lives can lead to the brightest legacies we leave behind. My children thought they were writing the final chapter of my story when they raised those champagne glasses. Instead, they were writing the first chapter of the most important work of my life. Some inheritances are measured in money. Others are measured in lives saved, families protected, and justice served. I know which inheritance I would choose, and I know which one will outlast us all. The story my children tried to end has become the story that will never end. A legacy of protection, courage, and justice that will serve families long after my name is forgotten. That, I have discovered, is the only inheritance that truly matters.